Welcome to episode 60 of the Virtual Velo Podcast, a very special episode. Well, actually, it's not really going to be a special episode, except for the fact that you have me. Emma is tied up with some of her commentary obligations, so she's not able to join us today. And it's probably good practice for me for when she becomes too big a star for me and she moves on. But we have another star with us today, and I'm very happy to announce that we have Captain South Africa, Aaron Borrill, with us. And when I say star, he is a star in esports. He's participated in 3 world championships. He's been the captain of the team. He's finished very well in the Zwift games last season, and he's also a award-winning journalist and the first to commission an article for me. So I'm really looking forward to having a journalist chat with Aaron. Welcome.
Thanks, Chris. Really excited to be on the podcast again. It's been a while, but there's lots of things to discuss, and I'm just really happy to be here. So thanks for the invite.
Yeah, it's actually really timely that I have you on because there are a couple pretty significant blockbuster announcements that have happened in the world of cycling esports, and having another journalist perspective on this, I think, is going to be very helpful. But let's start off with the World Championships. You've had experience with the World Championships on Zwift, and you were the captain of the team for the past World Championships that was on MyWhoosh, the live event final that was back in October. You didn't participate in the event, but you were very closely involved with the athletes and the federation. I want to just get a sense from you as to what were your biggest takeaways from the World Championships this season?
Yeah, so I think with the finals that were recently aired, I mean, a live event is definitely the way to go. I think it makes it very special and makes the event quite tangible. I don't think many people know how much effort it takes into putting on an event of that nature. The organization, securing the venue, transforming it, the building of the stages, the electronics, the comms, the broadcast. It's a hell of a lot of work. I've worked at an event organizing company before, the Cape Epic. It's a gargantuan task, and it's something that never gets the credit it deserves, especially the people working on the ground behind the scenes. They need to be acknowledged too and thanked, because without them, what we saw in Abu Dhabi wouldn't be possible. I like the idea around the public pathway qualifiers, the semi-final, then leading on to the final. This means more athletes around the world had an opportunity to participate and get involved. And that's what cycling esports is all about: inclusivity, exclusivity, and community. I wasn't really a fan of, I'm being honest here, I wasn't a fan of the 2 MCs. I think they missed the point completely. They made a couple of errors too. That was a mistake, I feel. And I also don't think the weigh-in window and what followed, I don't agree with it. I mean, 2 hours before, the weigh-in for 2 hours before has become the standard. We either stick with that or we weigh in live on the stage just before the ride is about to go out. Saunas and all that nonsense needs to stop. It's not good for the sport. It puts it in a bad light, in my opinion. And it's not healthy. It sets a bad example for the younger generation and goes against the spirit of the sport. So a lot more positives than negatives. Very happy with what we saw. And I think this is just going to elevate and get onto a grander scale in the coming years.
Yeah, I can certainly agree with you as far as the grandeur of the production that was going on there, being on the ground in Abu Dhabi. I marveled that there were hundreds of staff there. The space was immense. The stage was, everything was coordinated very well. And I know you mentioned the weigh-in process. I think I know that, I wrote the extreme dieting articles. I've been affected by disordered eating. It's a very personal issue to me. And this did come up while we were there. And I worry that it was more an issue of logistics than it was rider welfare. And I think that will be addressed in the future. I really do. I think they may have underestimated the reaction to that. But the other thing is that I've asked a number of riders, and they've all said to me, this is the nature of the sport. This is what we do. We're all kind of in the same boat here. But, that's a very nuanced topic, and I certainly hope that it'll be addressed further in the future. And I certainly respect your opinion on that.
No, I'm not knocking anyone or anything in terms of that. Everything was done within the rules. There was nothing wrong in terms of playing by the rules. I just think that it could have been handled a little better. That's all.
Yeah, I certainly agree. And one of the areas that Em and I have spoken with several national federations, esports coordinators, and I'm of the belief that the federations as a whole could handle things differently. And I know that's the South African Cycling Federation, which you're a member of, has bought in with cycling esports. They recognize the national team, there's support there. Can you tell me, how that played out for this World Championships?
Yeah, so Cycling South Africa is 100% behind cycling esports, and the federation views it in the same light as all the other cycling disciplines. And that's why the federation spends so much time selecting a team, identifying athletes to represent the country well in advance. The new leadership team at Cycling South Africa comprises a mix of experience and youth, and they're a great bunch of people, and they strive for excellence. And based on that, it was imperative that the riders identified were elite level athletes with proven track records and well-standing reputations, and had the results to back things up.
Yeah, and well, they certainly put forward two incredible athletes in James Barnes and Kelsey Schnorr, I believe that's the way you pronounce her name.
Kelsey van Schoor.
I'm glad that you're here so you could correct me with that. So you were the captain of the team. What was your role going forward with the semis and the finals?
Yeah, so as captain, I worked closely with both squads, the men's and the women's team. We did eventually elect a captain to lead the women's team, Jill Pruitt, but I still helped coordinate and ensure all the prerequisites were met and that everyone was prepared and ready come race day. As you mentioned, Chris, the men's team had a lot of experience on their side. There wasn't much that needed addressing. With James Barnes, Brad Guveris, and we've been involved in the last 3 editions of the UCI Cycling Esports World Champs. So we know the level of commitment that's needed in terms of training, performance verification, preparation, etc. This year, however, we were joined by 4 other quality athletes, including Henry Ace. He's a former road professional and a MyWhoosh veteran. As a team, we had an idea what will work best for us, and that would be individual performances for the semifinals. And if we managed to get the numbers to qualify for the finals, there would have been a lot more strategy involved in terms of stage 1, especially how the Americans played that. So we needed numbers for the final. We did our best. Unfortunately, we only managed to qualify 2 riders, Kelsey and James.
Yeah, well, both of them put in pretty heroic performances to get there. And I just it says a lot for a relatively small federation to put racers into the finals like that. But it also highlights the importance of the federations in esports in general, in an international event like this. What is your feeling as far as the national federations holistically supporting esports? How can they further engage and grow with the discipline?
So that's a tough question, Chris. I think Cycling South Africa are vested in cycling esports and have committed to it both in the short and the long term. Cycling South Africa isn't the biggest federation and doesn't have the financial clout like some of the bigger countries. But I think along with the Danish, American, and Australian federations, we're leading the charge for growing and developing and acknowledging the discipline. I stand to be corrected, but South Africa, and Cycling South Africa in particular, is the only federation that issues elite national colours to its riders, which are approved by SASCOC, that's South Africa's Olympic Commission. I think that's a pretty big deal when it comes to the clout of esports and what it means to the federation. From South Africans' Road Commission's perspective, they reckon it's a discipline that they want to grow for the future. They're looking at organizing a South African national esports champs. And at the moment, they're looking at the best way forward and the next steps to organize the event so that all South African esports athletes have the opportunity to take part in something big.
Yeah, I agree. And we have mentioned this in the past that one of the answers when I asked Jacob of the UCI and Matt of MyWhoosh, what would you do differently next year? And they both said early engagement with the federations. And, that's certainly great. We need the federations. But the way the event was structured made it very challenging for the federations because they were there for the semifinals, but then the live event final, which was obviously in Abu Dhabi, there was really not a mechanism for the federations to be there supporting their athletes. So we want them to be involved early, but we don't want them to be involved late. It's kind of an oxymoron, and it's counterintuitive or counterproductive to what we're trying to create here. I know that in the road world, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but there are parallel events with the federations where there are meetings or there are other events that involve the federations. And I would love to get to the point where the live event final would also involve maybe a satellite event where all the federations come in and they see what's going on and there's an exchange of ideas. Like, I can just tell you that one of the most rewarding parts of the live event final was having all of the athletes together, and we'd be sitting down at breakfast and having these really high level conversations around esports. And I was thinking to myself while I was there, it would be wonderful if the federations were involved in this, where they're hearing these athletes and we're getting that word out there. So, hopefully that's something that, as the sport evolves, we allow that to happen. From your perspective, after seeing the championships unfold, do you feel that the national governing bodies and the UCI are doing enough to support cycling esports? And where do you think that they can improve?
Yeah, I think for the most part they are. I do feel that the UCI and the race organizers and platforms such as MyWhoosh and Zwift need to give federation athletes a little bit more time. I know it's tricky, and this comes down to the event dates and the pathway events, etc. But this will allow for better athlete identification and verification, race preparation, and give federations time to make provision for kit allocations and the like. That said, every year, and I'm speaking on behalf of Team South Africa here, the organization leading up to the showpiece gets better and better. Cycling South Africa has official selection criteria. It's detailed and exceptionally well executed, leaving no opportunity for disputes. And as far as South African cycling esports goes, there's also a possibility of having a national squad from which to select our athletes. That's something I'm working on and pushing for. Now that there are several elite level competitions happening every year, identification becomes easier. And if riders want to race for the country, they know that they need to get involved, not just for selection, but to be exposed to that high level of racing and the stimulus required to be competitive at the World Championships. We don't want to merely send riders to the World Championships. We want them to compete, and we want them to bring back medals.
Yeah, and that certainly is an ideal that we all want as the sport progresses. I mentioned the athletes, and one of the comments that I heard from quite a few of them was, this is a proper world championship for us. This is a proper world championship for esports. Some went as far as to say it's the first proper world championships that we've had. Did you see it that way? Did you see it as a proper world championship and a seminal event for the sport?
I think every world championships was a proper world championships. It's just each edition has got better and better. And we've seen the sport move to a different platform. MyWhoosh obviously has a lot more money behind it and was able to put on a show that the sport deserves. And as far as it being a proper world championships, of course, it was wonderful to see, and I was envious sitting at home watching that event. It was something I would have loved to have been part of. But going forward, I think it's just going to get better and better.
That's interesting that you say that you were envious, because it took a lot to get there. And I know that there were a lot of mixed feelings, and it's an emotional topic in a lot of ways. And my hope was that it would go off well enough for athletes like you, elite athletes, that would wish they would be there rather than the opposite. And, it's great for you to hear that. And speaking of emotional topics, we originally were going to get together to break down the Zwift Games 2025. But there have been some significant turn of events in the esports landscape. And you mentioned that there were many elite events on the calendar. And I'm specifically speaking of Zwift and their postponement of the Zwift World Series. It's a significant topic, so I certainly want to address that with you, and we can readdress the Zwift Games down the line if and when they become relevant. But this topic is, it's also very emotional. There are many sides, and it's also extremely nuanced. And I want to approach it in the way that you and I are two journalists were discussing in this. I wrote a fairly comprehensive article that's in Cycling News where you can get the majority of the details about the postponement and the reasons why. But I also took the opportunity to reach out to Zwift to get some clarity. The community sometimes uses me as a lightning rod, and I get a lot of different questions, and I wanted to get them out there. So rather than me injecting my opinion into this, I'm going to tell you what my questions were and what Zwift said to me, and then you can react to that.
That sounds good to me.
Okay, so the reason for the postponement was because there were a series of annulments, and it was identified that the hardware was producing inaccurate readings. There was drift. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a smart trainer specialist by any means. There are other content creators that do a lot better job of that than I do. So I reached out to Zwift and I asked them this question. Can you clarify which hardware models are affected by the issue? For example, and the reason why I mentioned these models is because they were mentioned in the annulment reports and mentioned previously. And I know that the riders were using these when they're annulled. Does this include only auto-calibrated Justo 1 and Justo 2? Those are elite models. Kicker V5 and V6, Kicker Move, and Kicker Bikes. Those were the models that I had a feeling were involved in this. They responded by saying, during the Zwift World Series, riders on all the equipment listed above received annulments because of their specific performance on the day could not be verified. In all cases, we have made the relevant manufacturers aware when we see this happen. The manufacturers are working on diagnosing root causes and making updates where necessary.
Yeah, I think these issues, Chris, have been going on since as early as the Zwift Games in March, when several riders expressed and experienced anomalies with the equipment. And this was, I think, was the start of in inverted commas, the ghost watts issue with the Kicker V6. And as far as I know, these were and still are fringe cases affecting a small number of riders, but it's been seen across the board. Elite level riders and community riders. It's not just the elite level riders. But I do think the onus is on the athlete to acknowledge and identify that there is an issue and try to rectify it as quickly as possible. This means dual recording all your rides, workouts, and try to troubleshoot any anomalies. And once these are identified, then it's going to go through the right channels with said smart trainer manufacturers to get warranty replacements, install new firmware, do factory spin downs, etc. The big issue here, though, is that many elite level riders already do this. We all know it's part of the game, and we don't want any fingers being pointed. Those that were and have been annulled were experiencing issues during the race, and these were only identified after the fact. You can't prepare for this. When you're racing at the highest level, you've done all the various weighing protocols, you've dealt with all the stress leading up to the race, which is usually in the evening after work. You just want to get your race done. You just want to get to the start line and focus on the race. You aren't monitoring your dual recordings while you're bleeding up a virtual climb. But still, even if you did notice some drift, what are you actually supposed to do while you're racing? Do you just exit the event? So I think it's something that all the elite level races and participants are already doing. If there are issues, they've already been identified and already working through them. So some of these annulments are pretty peculiar in terms of someone, losing their result because of an incorrectly paired cadence sensor, for example.
I agree with you that certainly the burden is on the athlete, but when you have equipment that isn't accurate or is not reacting the way that you consistently see it happening, then it's out of your hands. And I think that it's an important distinction to make that this is an intent to cheat, right? It's not happening intentionally. The athletes aren't trying to game the system. But it's kind of one of these things where it's a little bit puzzling because when is it happening? Why is it happening all of a sudden? What has changed between then and now? So I asked Zwift what specific circumstances caused this issue, and does the performance verification team believe it's possible to accurately verify performances going forward? If these trainers are doing these things, when are they doing them? Why are they doing them? How are they doing them? And what's going to prevent them from continuing to do that? This is Zwift's response. It's hard to say. We have seen accuracy issues occur in a range of different circumstances across the different rounds and routes. This is why we are pausing so that manufacturers and riders can collaborate with riders to further understand and diagnose root causes and circumstances. One circumstance that has been verified due to our collaboration with Wahoo is an edge case where the power reading from certain trainers can drift under high torque, resulting from very high power during low cadence efforts, typically on climb. And we're going to discuss the statements from Wahoo that I received a little bit later, but pertaining to the verifying performances going forward, Zwift said it is still entirely possible to accurately verify performances that display clear hardware issues do not pass validation, and this is why there have been more annulments. We believe it is in everyone's interest to try and remediate any issues riders see with their equipment in the upcoming period so that we don't have any issues during the Zwift Games. I don't know. What is your impression there?
It's tricky. It's a hard question to answer, and I don't think I can answer that question because I don't think there's a definitive answer at the moment. Is it maybe platform software or something to do with algorithms? I don't know, but it's not good for the credibility of the sport at the moment. But I do feel that Zwift putting a pause on the Zwift World Series is a good call because, number one, they've identified a problem. Number two, They want to make sure that the competing riders are all on a level playing field. And number three is they want to sort the issue out. So rather than let things carry on the way they're going, and perhaps us seeing more and more annulments, more and more individuals getting black marks next to their names, let's rather sort things out, move forward, identify the problem, and then we start again.
It is challenging because none of us have seen that data. We don't know what the algorithms are. We don't know what the protocols are. We're trusting what's happening there. And I guess Zwift is doing the same thing. And we have to, certainly give the benefit of the doubt that it's being handled by independent authorities and go forward. But it does beg another question, which I asked Zwift, and that is, why is this decision happening now, considering past editions of the Zwift Grand Prix and Premier Division used the same performance verification team and the same hardware? To which they replied, "These are new issues that relate to the accuracy of data and rider hardware under certain conditions. These issues emerged this season and past editions, including Swift Grand Prix and Premier Division, were not impacted by these new hardware-related issues." Before I get your impression there, the mention was of fringe cases, high power, low torque on climbs. I can certainly understand with the big, huge, powerful racers that are putting out huge watts, but a number of the annulments involved female riders who are inherently lighter and not putting out that power. But there's a little bit of an inconsistency there. We'll discuss what Wahoo responded a little bit later as well.
It's a tricky one, Chris. They've identified the issue as high power scenarios or high torque scenarios, and a high torque scenario doesn't necessarily mean a high power scenario. I think it just pertains to certain cadence situations. So if you're looking at a low sort of torque effort, it's probably cadence of 60 or below. And I know some of the riders do have a particular style where they ride at between 50 and 60 cadence, the women included. So perhaps the wording from Zwift's part was slightly off. I personally don't think it's high power efforts. It's probably high torque efforts.
So now we've identified these things. What are we going to do going forward? We've made the decision. And when I say we, I'm speaking hypothetically on behalf of Zwift. We're going to pause things. And what are we going to do in the interim? So I asked them, what steps do you intend to implement before resuming competition to address the issue? And they responded by saying, by pausing the series, we are providing all riders with a chance to get their equipment fully dialed in partnership with manufacturers, putting it back onto the racers, as you had mentioned earlier. We have engaged with all of the relevant manufacturers who have established specialized rider support addresses for elite riders. We'll support this process by also providing specific elite style events that riders can use to identify issues. As part of this process, we are also actively engaging with manufacturers as Zwift, as well as to assist wherever we can. We firmly believe these issues can be remediated through firmware updates. We will also take this opportunity to revisit the rules, as we feel there are opportunities to introduce less severe penalties for riders impacted by equipment malfunction that are beyond their reasonable control. So just before I get your impression on that, Aaron, in an email that went out today to the racers, there was mentioned that there are going to be test events. They're going to reschedule the races for after the Zwift Games in March. Elite Race 4 and Elite Race 5, they're going to create tests to test these things. So I guess that's good going forward. Putting the onus back on the racers for equipment is, when we've already kind of made it pretty clear that it's the equipment that's the issue and not the racers. I guess as an elite racer, that is your responsibility. But there are many people that believe that the equipment, the way it is originally manufactured, and we're talking about Wahoo and Elite. I'm not an engineer here, but just people that know more about it who I've spoken to, they say that equipment was never, ever really created for elite racing. It was created for Joe Schmo like me who wants to get a good workout and maybe race with my friends in the community. It doesn't have the technology required, precision and the accuracy. And they say firmware updates in the world aren't going to do anything. But that certainly we will see how those remediations from Wahoo play out. And as far as revisiting the rules, that's certainly a positive step, because as well as I do that whether it's an annulment for intent to cheat or not, the court of public opinion in this community provides justice with a very swift hand.
Yeah, I mean, if I look at answering, or at least weighing in on some of those statements by Zwift, I think as a racer, most of the participants in the Zwift World Series are rightfully disappointed. They're prepared for it. They've trained for it. A lot of their esports season is built around particular events. So you've got Sunday Race Club and MyWhoosh, you've got World Championships, you've got Zwift World Series, which was potentially a qualifying feeder series to Zwift Games. What happens now, I don't know. But I think what's happened is all that Zwift can do for now, and it's a good decision to pause things before they spiral even more. But I can tell you is that what we as elite riders already is the dual recording and troubleshooting what's going on with our trainers if there are issues. We don't just pitch up to a race and only dual record that particular race. All the top riders religiously dual record. And I'll go as far as to say is they get things sorted out by liaising with trainer manufacturers and support already. At my BL13 trade team, we discussed this ad nauseum and tried to troubleshoot as best we can among the team. We openly talk about these things. We give advice to new members, and we use our experience to help others to potentially try and sort these things out. As a rider, I want to know that everyone is on a level playing field. When the level is as high as it is, it's not fair that others are gaining an advantage. I know it's not their fault. So to me, this makes sense. It's albeit disappointing for those taking part and preparing for these events. I think for us to move forward and for Zwift to get a handle on what's happening and rectify it, what they've done in terms of pausing the event was the right decision.
Well, that's certainly an interesting perspective. And when you think about perspective, these elite events have been going on for years. So I asked Zwift, does this raise doubts about past elite competitions? To which they said, where material issues with hardware accuracy have been seen in past events on Zwift riders have been also annulled. During the Zwift World Series, we have seen a higher volume of issues, so more riders have been annulled. We cannot comment on past elite competitions or other platforms.
I mean, I personally don't think it's put the sport or the cycling esports discipline in disrepute or raises any questions about past performances. I agree with Zwift that this can likely be remedied by a software update or installing new firmware. And for the most part, for Zwift to put their hand up, acknowledge there's an issue, look to fix it, are actions of an organizer that cares about the legitimacy of cycling esports.
Very interesting. I then asked them, what steps are being taken to work with hardware manufacturers to correct these issues? They said, we are in active conversation with the manufacturers. The manufacturers have also opened up specialized direct support hotlines for the esports athletes to further identify the root causes of issues and develop any necessary firmware solutions. You as an elite athlete are the ultimate test case. You have putting these trainers through their paces. Being able to work directly with the manufacturers, I would assume, is very appealing to you and having a direct line of communication. If this moves the sport forward in that way, where there's innovation that's being driven by the elite competition, that certainly is a positive byproduct of this. If it does create trainers that can actually produce the numbers and the accuracy and the position that we're looking for.
Yeah, I think at the moment, the support from the smart trainer manufacturers has been very good. As a cycling tech journalist and editor, I'm in the fortunate position where I test these products for a living, and I have access to all sorts of things, spanning power meters and cycling computers to smart trainers, etc. I currently have 7 smart trainers at home that I'm testing and using. None of my kickers have had the ghost watt issues, but I've done the suggested firmware update anyway. And if anything, my kicker V6 is under reading if I compare my dual recordings to pre-new firmware level. It isn't by a lot. Before it would deviate by 1%. Now it's 2 to 3%. It isn't a train smash or anything to that effect. My V5 is spot on as usual. That is such a good unit. I have had issues with the Elite Justo 1. I've had resistance problems, strange cadence sensations, if I can describe it that way, and some accuracy issues, overreading and underreading on different days. This, however, was solved by a simple firmware update, thanks to some really good help from Elite in Italy. The Justo 1 is now reading true. It's performing really well. It's within 1 and 2% deviation. And I've also got an Elite Justo 2 on the way, which I'll be testing and comparing to the Justo 1. So each manufacturer, each trainer, they perform slightly differently. Of course, it's different technology. They have their own little nuances in how you produce power. Some of them, when you stop pedaling, they drop power instantly. Others hold on to the power a little bit longer than others. So they're all different. And I think within these batches of trainers, there are going to be units that don't perform like they should. That is the truth when it comes to mass production on things, quality control. When you're producing things at such high volume, you're going to get different batches. So perhaps some units are affected by something. Maybe one fell off a truck, it damaged the optical sort of sensor. There are those things to consider, but the support is there. You just need to contact Wahoo, you need to contact Elite. I'm going through the same channels a normal customer would go through. I'm not using special support because I'm a journalist. I'm going through the channels everyone else is going through, and the support is fantastic, and I'm getting replies pretty quickly, and they're on standby to help and support. And the firmware updates so far have remedied the issues for me. I decided to take a break and not do Zwift World Series. So I'm not sure if I would be experiencing the same issues if I was participating. But currently in the racing that I'm doing now in Zwift Racing League, and even if I look at the recordings I did for the World Championships, I wasn't experiencing any of this drift. So this very much could be fringe cases, Chris. It's really hard to pinpoint, and it's really hard to point a finger of blame, say it's that person, it's that trainer, it's that manufacturer. At this point, it's a guessing game.
That's not a great position to be in if you're an athlete. And the sanctions or the annulments, they certainly come with a stigma. So Zwift mentioned changing the rule book. So I followed up with, how do you plan to amend the rule book to address these scenarios in the future? Because when you think about it, the annulled riders, they were annulled from the races. They lost the points for that. We know that the races leading up to the Zwift Games were going to be qualifications for the Zwift Games. So now by canceling the fourth and fifth race, the annulled racers can't use races to qualify for the Zwift game. So it's kind of like a double whammy for them. They're getting penalized twice for something that was beyond their control. So Zwift responded by saying, we will be working on the rule book over the coming months, but we would like to explore sanctions and remedies that are less severe than the current rules when athletes encounter unintentional infraction. How does that make you feel?
Yeah, I think this sounds fair to me. I mean, regardless of what an annulment ruling states, I mean, we in the position within our teams and within the broader elite community that we get the detailed annulment report. So it will say rider X was annulled for an incorrectly paired cadence sensor. Rider Y was annulled because there was a zero offset calibration issue with their trainer, right? Within the community, this potentially blights your reputation, and questions start getting asked about your performance and the legitimacy of previous performances. There's also the scarring involved here too, particularly when you've won a race or you've scored prime points and then it gets removed from the results. I mean, the community is already cutthroat when it comes to this sort of issue. And some individuals are always looking for the next witch hunt, Chris. We know this. The abuse some of the riders are experiencing at the moment, it's not good. It shouldn't be happening. I think before anybody jumps to conclusions, number one, you need to put yourself in the shoes of that person in question before you open your mouth and slander them. If you do have anything to say, make sure you tell them to their face and not behind their backs. We're adults here. We aren't children. These annulments are not happening in low-level community races because those aren't sanctioned. It's at the highest level. These are athletes that have competed and completed myriad power tests. They have provided substantial in real-life data and have in real-life race results too. They aren't going out there to openly cheat. The term annulment or DQ is far too harsh, in my opinion, even for having the wrong cadence sensor pair. I'm happy that this will potentially be addressed, or at least some new terminology pertaining to these issues rolled out, instead of saying you've been annulled or you've been DQ'd, because those two symbols have too many negative connotations attached to them.
It's refreshing to hear somebody of your standing in the elite community, a racer, the captain of the South African national team, a tech journalist, saying that, because I've said it numerous times. This community can't get out of its own way. The infighting, take baseball, for instance, right? Their union is so strong. It trickles down to, the rules. It trickles down to the salaries that they command. They have their backs through thick and thin. And I truly feel that if this race community did the same thing, that this sport would be much further along than it is now, that it would be accepted by the traditional cycling community better, and there would be a much more unified stance going forward when dealing with these type of things with the platforms, with the hardware manufacturers, rather than everybody blaming each other. And then there's what do you do from there? It's a toxic environment. But using this as an opportunity to move forward, I asked the question: does this situation further highlight the need for collaboration between hardware manufacturers, virtual cycling platforms, and governing bodies to establish universal accuracy standards specific to cycling esports? How can we use this to improve the future of virtual cycling and get this sport to a place where it's a reputable, unique discipline? Zwift kind of responded with a response I would have expected, but hoped for a little bit more. They said, "We have maintained an active dialogue with manufacturers and governing bodies throughout this process. We strongly support the need for a universal standard for cycling esports." Before I get your impression, you're familiar with trainer homologation. I've wrote several articles on the UCI implementing the trainer homologation program. Do you think that will mitigate this problem?
Potentially, yes. You're really putting me on the spot here with some tough questions here, Chris. But I think there's always going to be more issues and gremlins for riders competing from home, especially with different, albeit pre-approved trainer brands used among the riders. The recent World Champs in Abu Dhabi demonstrated fairness and parity across the board with the standardized trainers, and I also like the randomly assigned pods. But this is an expensive and costly exercise. I'm not sure what Zwift can do to remedy this, but perhaps home participation races should only be used for qualification purposes with no prize money. And those that qualify potentially for the final will race in an arena on standardized equipment and randomly assigned pods. I think MyWhoosh got that right at the World Championships, that those pods that the riders were competing in were randomly assigned. It wasn't that one's reading more than the other, so I'm going to go to that one. I think that creates fairness. Standardized, homologated trainers, that makes sense. I don't think you can get that from racing at home. And when there's money on the line, I don't think racing at home should be part of the long-term goal. I think qualification, yes, because that brings in inclusivity, right? But finals, that should be done in an arena in the same vein as what we saw in World Champs. I know it's costly. I know it's probably something that we're only going to see a long way down the line, but I think that is going to be the way forward.
You'd like to see a Zwift Games live event?
Yes, 100%.
So would I, to tell you the truth. I think that the live event, having seen one, it was one of the most epic athletic events that I've seen live. And I've seen quite a few. I'm a huge sports fan here in the States. And it was an amazing event. And I'm sure I'm biased, but it was pretty cool. So that's the responses that I received from Zwift. But I tried to get a pretty broad view of this topic. So I also reached out to Wahoo, who didn't respond to me, but I was working together with Josh Croxton on this piece, and he's the editor from Cycling News. And he received this from Wahoo that I'm going to relate to you now. They said, Zwift have been in communication with all the relevant hardware manufacturers, and Wahoo is one of these. We have worked quickly on a fix for elite indoor riders competing in events over the coming month. This is now available for Kicker V6 and Kicker Move. We expect a fast follow for those Kicker V5. There will be a full rollout to all Wahoo users in early January 2025. So they're saying firmware is going to fix it. We're going to roll that out to the elite racers first, to the general community later. What is your feeling about this statement from Wahoo?
Yeah, I think this harks back to some of the questions we've dealt with earlier. Is this perhaps something that's driven by those incredibly low cadence numbers we're seeing, like 50 and below? Perhaps that's overwhelming the strain gauges in the smart trainer. I don't know. I can't really comment on those mechanics and how it works because I'm not an engineer myself. I like writing story, but as previously mentioned, I personally, a lot of the riders I race with, we haven't experienced these issues on any of our equipment. And I've done all the suggested firmware updates. My Kicker V6 does that automatically anyway. And as I previously mentioned, what I have noticed, if anything, is that there's a slight underreport on my Kicker V6 compared to the historic dual recordings, which were within 1%.
Yeah, it's certainly a nuanced topic. And this occurred originally in October after there were some annulments that occurred there. And there was a statement from Wahoo after that. I believe it was the second race. And they said then in a statement, under extreme conditions, specifically high absolute power on extended climbs at 100% trainer difficulty, power may drift slightly on kicker V6 and move only. That's contrasting to their statement that they provided this week, which also includes the kicker V5. We believe this is an edge case that impacts only the most powerful indoor racing specialists. Now, you wouldn't need a rollout for all Wahoo users if this is a edge case that only involves certain users, as they mentioned in the most recent statement fix. But in the interim, we advise elite riders to set trainer difficulty to 50%. And I think that probably points to the low cadence, high torque that you mentioned. Since you've mentioned that a couple of times, there are people who feel that riding style, that very unique to esports riding style, isn't in the nature of cycling, right? If you go out and ride on the road, I watched Jason Osborne stay out of the saddle for 20 minutes in that third race of the World Championships and ride away from everybody. You can't do that on the road. Are you of the belief that shouldn't be allowed in cycling esports, or is cycling esports a unique discipline and you should be able to develop whatever styles are most successful for you?
Yeah, I think it's a unique discipline for sure. If I look at my background, when I'm racing outdoors and particularly when I'm doing time trials, my average cadence is over 100, which is pretty high. If I look at my mountain bike races, my average cadence is pretty low because those are long climbs, it's low torque efforts. Probably looking at average cadences between 65 and 70 for a mountain bike race. And if I look at cycling esports and racing at the highest level, for me, they kind of resemble, if I can use that word, mountain bike racing, where there's a lot more climbing and you naturally produce cadence. I don't go anywhere near 100 cadence average when I'm racing cycling esports. It's probably at averages around 65. And there are times when I'm on a climb and my cadence drops to 50. So I think it is discipline specific, and it depends on the race. It depends on the terrain, the virtual parkour, if you want to call it that. I wouldn't say we should make it illegal. I think it's part of the discipline. But if things get absurd and riders are in 30 cadence, there's a big problem there. I do also know in terms of physiology, and I've been speaking to a sports scientist about this, it is actually impossible to ride at 50 cadence for 90 minutes and produce ridiculously high wattage and watts per kilogram numbers. But most of these races, particularly the ones at Zwift World Series, are shorter races. I can't comment on that. I'm not a sports scientist. I'm not a scientist. I'm not an engineer. But what I can say is that the cycling disciplines that I've competed in, my cadence is specific to those disciplines. So road cycling and time trialing, it's really, really high. Mountain biking, it's pretty low. And cycling esports, it's like a combination of the two. It can get high, it can get really low, but it kind of balances out, at around like 60, 65. That's just for me. I think it is a low cadence discipline.
So when you say it's discipline specific, this issue that we're discussing right now with the trainer accuracy, in theory, it shouldn't be platform specific, right? If it's happening on Zwift, it should be happening on other platforms as well. And the email that was sent out to the racers had this passage in it from Zwift. The issues we have seen are not specific to the Zwift platform and have been verified to happen in events on other platforms by Athlete Analytics, which is the independent verification service that Zwift is contracting for their elite events, using data proactively provided by riders. Now, before we go into MyWhoosh's response to this, because you don't have to be an investigative journalist to know who this is focused at, right? So the first question that I want to ask you is this appropriate for Zwift as they're making this announcement about their platform to essentially be pointing fingers at other platforms? Does it have a hint of transferring accountability? Does it make the motivations questioned in the minds of the community? And was it really necessary?
I mean, I can't really comment on that. And personally, I don't know how Zwift is getting access to sort of dual recording data from MyWhoosh anyway to make a comment of that nature? I can't really answer that question, Chris. But yeah, I think it's something that all the platforms need to address. I think there needs to be an open forum. Egos need to be put aside. Platforms need to come together, and we need to standardize this procedure. Because I can tell you, even from an athlete perspective, I don't want to be doing 30,000 Power Passport tests a year to be able to compete on various platforms. I think we need a centralized athlete analytics, if you want to call it, hub that takes care of all of the verification processes needed. That I think would be a step in the right direction. But in terms of people pointing fingers and if it was correct of Zwift to make that particular statement and comment, I can't answer that.
That's basically what MyWhoosh said to me as well. We're not going to comment on statements that are made by other platforms utilizing third-party services, which I can certainly understand. But when I did ask them, rephrasing the question, have you identified these issues on your platform and how are you addressing them? MyWhoosh did provide me with a pretty significant statement that I want to read to you, also addressing whether the dual recordings are available to the athletes if they request them. So I'm going to read you the statement that MyWhoosh provided to me now. At MyWhoosh, we employ a variety of parameters to validate a rider's performance. Our verification procedures include evaluation of both a rider's performance physiology testing and hardware testing. This allows us to develop a comprehensive and holistic view on athletes' performance before proceeding with any decision on annulment or disqualification from our premium events. So I think that's a pretty important distinction to make, because when I see Zwift, I see a huge prioritization on hardware, whereas on MyWhoosh, there's a greater prioritization of physiological performances. And I think that the philosophies are slightly different, and it's interesting to note that. As cycling esports evolve, we also continuously refine our protocols. One of our focuses is to address potential discrepancies arising from power meter and smart trainer variances. Over the course of verifying more than 1,500 esports events, we have encountered various equipment issues, often due to user error, flat batteries, miscalibration, hardware malfunctions, or even deliberate tampering. As we identify these issues, we have refined our verification processes to detect anomalies and take necessary steps to assess their impact on the athlete's performance and the event results. At MyWhoosh, our goal is to ensure a level playing field for esports. This commitment drove our rigorous verification of trainers used in the UCI World Championships. We also collected secondary data from the World Championships racers to allow for historical and future comparisons. This approach enables us to maintain a holistic view of athletes and their performances. And this is the statement about the dual recordings. Upon request, MyWhoosh can provide athletes with additional data regarding their verification process to help them address and rectify any issues. At MyWhoosh, we believe in esports and are open to collaborating with the UCI and manufacturers to help develop more accurate and tamper-proof products for the esports market.
That sounds fantastic, doesn't it, Chris? I really like how they've worded that and how they're addressing things going forward. I also like that they use rider physiology and dial that into the equation too. So it's not just hardware in terms of smart trainer and secondary source power meter. If there is a discrepancy, I think they go and they look at rider physiology too, and then they make their decision. And that with collective historic data on each rider, I think that is the way forward. The next question is, how does Zwift and other platforms carry out a similar way of handling these? And as I mentioned before, I do think it needs to be centralized. If the sport is going to become professional, if we want the sport to become professional, certain things need to be centralized. Rankings need to be centralized across all platforms. So that you don't have Zwift Power, you don't have whatever the other platforms have. Races are weighted. They can create some kind of algorithm and calculation which brings everything into one central ranking system, and you can be ranked. And I think we should have something similar when it comes to the dual recording and the athletes analytics, verification, whatever you want to call it. If we meet those requirements, or if we meet those targets, I think that it will fast track the sport into a professional era, and it will silence critics, will silence the naysayers, and these witch hunts, these ridiculous witch hunts, which are causing mental anguish for athletes. It's going to stop.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because when we interviewed Jacob Fraser, the esports coordinator for the UCI, he mentioned the international ranking. He mentioned the centralized database as all pillars. And I certainly know that that's part of their vision based upon what he had said. I just don't know when that's going to happen, but I certainly hope that that is a goal that we're able to realize sometime soon. So just moving on from this topic, there was another follow-up email from Zwift to update the community, the racing community, on what's going to happen. So just want to get that out there also, and then we'll put this topic to rest for a while. I know it probably won't be the last time that we speak about it, but it'll be the last time that we speak about it on this podcast. So Elite Race 4 is going to be rescheduled for April 10th and Race 5 for April 24th. That is after the Zwift Games, which will be throughout most of March. The prize money will be paid out for the first 3 races. If you made money through first 3 races, they're going to pay that money out now. There will be an additional qualification race on February 22nd for the Zwift Games. I didn't crunch the numbers. We kind of were crunched for time to get to the recording here, whether those annulled riders will be able to make up the points that they lost because of being annulled. But there is going to be another qualification. And they're also going to have a series of test events, as we mentioned earlier. So I know this is going to be a developing and evolving story, and it'll come up again. I want to move on to a different topic that is a little bit more enlightening for cycling esports. And as we're recording this podcast, the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, is in executive board meetings. I am proud to say, hopefully, we're going to come out of this podcast and hopefully have the announcement sitting in front of us, and we're going to proceed as if that certainly is the case, because I've been told by David Lepartien, interviewing in person, that that's the road that we were headed down. So cycling esports has now entered the Olympic era, and I'm interested in how this is viewed by somebody who's in the community. Do you consider this a significant development for the sport? And if so, how significant is it?
Yes, of course. It's absolutely massive, Chris. I think the Olympics is right up there with the World Championships when it comes to prestige. So to have the opportunity to participate in the Olympic Games is something most people dream about. And I think this move represents a massive leap for the discipline, 100%.
Yeah, it really is pretty amazing. And I'm going to try to contain my enthusiasm for this. Now, would you go as far as to say it's a game changer? Like, what potential benefits or challenges do you anticipate arising from the fact that cycling esports is going to be recognized in the Olympic esports games?
I wouldn't say it's a game changer. That's quite a massive word. The World Championships is always going to be the pinnacle of our sport, but I think the Olympics is a close second, in my opinion. And the benefits of such an event would include fast tracking platform issues and bug fixes, more in-person competition, which brings standardization across the board, reduces doubt, and it might help in fast tracking cycling esports to becoming a veritable professional sport. So there's a lot going for it, really. It's huge. It's huge, Chris.
Yeah, I think it's huge also. And the reason why I use the words game changer is because I asked this question to several heads of governing bodies. I asked Jim Miller of USA Cycling. I asked Martin Jongard of the Danish Cycling Union. I asked Connie Bjornhol of the Swedish Federation. And when I said game changer, they said absolutely. And they all pointed to financial support from their nation's Olympic committees. That if cycling esports is in the Olympic esports games, and it has the credibility, it gets the backing of the Olympic committees, which then infuses funds into the federations that can then be trickled down to the athletes for athlete development, for support for the games. So it's interesting. And if it does go that way and it helps legitimize the sport, then that certainly is a huge step forward.
I think from that perspective, then, mentioning what you just said, yes, that does bring game-changing elements to the discipline 100%. But I still think it's World Championships number 1, Olympics number 2, in my opinion. It might be different for other people, but rainbow bands number 1, Olympic gold second, or participating in the game second.
That's interesting that you say that. Being involved in the South African Cycling Federation, this basically doubles the number of high-profile international events on the calendar, and it doubles the work for the national governing bodies. How do you feel that they will address this? how should they address this?
Yeah, I think cycling South Africa is in a good space when it comes to this. And I think most federations will already have protocols in place for the traditional Olympics, or they can adapt and shape existing policies for cycling esports. So I've already chatted to Cycling South Africa about this, and the federation will follow the same selection criteria as governed and stipulated by the UCI allocation. So the only difference is that the selections will be approved by SASCOP, which is the South African Sports Confederation and Olympic Committee. With the roadmap we've already put in place for events such as the UCI Cycling Esports World Champs, it's just a matter of bolting this on and tweaking where necessary. As I mentioned earlier, Cycling South Africa is in a good position. Take cycling esports seriously, and the rider pathway and squad initiative, which I hope comes into play, will ensure our riders are ready.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I've done a lot of thought about what the qualification criteria would be, and I've asked around and what the format is going to be. And rather than ask you and put you on the spot, I'm going to give you a basic synopsis of what I've learned from my sources. And I want everyone to know that this is purely speculation, right? I haven't seen the proposals. Basically, the IOC it recognizes the UCI as a governing body of cycling, and they're going to look to the UCI to create this proposal. The IOC will either ratify it or ask for it to be amended, and we'll go forward that way. The way that I see the qualification going is basically just like the World Championships, where your nation's historic success will determine whether you get invited into pool play. I kind of see the pool play as being like Olympic rowing or UCI BMX freestyle events, where there is a pool play where there are, from what I understand, these are going to be very small teams of single gender. It'll be male teams of 2, 3, or 4 riders, female teams of 2, 3, or 4 riders that'll go into pool play. And from there'll be a winner's bracket and a loser's bracket that will come together in a semifinal. If you lose in the first round, you still have a chance to, if you win the loser's bracket, to come back into the semifinal. So you're not just leaving after one race, basically. And then a final where the medals will be divvied out. But it's not going to be like a world championship, in my opinion. It's going to be more like an actual Olympic event where you're going up and small teams are contesting against each other, really able to highlight the national teams and the Olympic spirit there. Does that sound appealing to you as an athlete?
Yeah, it does. I mean, if you look at current Olympic formats, particularly athletics, I think that's what happens already. There are these qualification rounds, like round 1 to 8. Even if you look at swimming, then the fastest 4 qualify through, and then you've got opportunity for the fastest loser to go through. So I really like that idea. I hope that actually comes to fruition. And you're right, Chris, because I'm pretty excited about what you just said.
Yeah, it is pretty cool, right? And it's also cool for the sport not only to open up to a whole nother generation of esports athletes, but also a much broader base of fans that may not know anything about it. Do you feel that the inclusion in the Olympic esports games will get us to the point where there are more eyes on the sport? And what can the sport, the governing bodies, and the athletes do to optimize the added exposure that the Olympics is going to provide the sport?
Yeah, the athletes will be revved up for this, I'm sure. I mean, in terms of fans, our sport is still growing, and while we're seeing more fans watching and getting drawn to the sport, we need more. We need lots more, and that's going to come from events like the Olympics. So we perhaps won't see massive or huge fan engagement for the first edition of the Olympics for cycling esports, but I think having that on the world stage and having people at a live Olympic esports event is going to bring new fans from different disciplines, from different events at the Olympics, at the Olympic esports, coming in and watching these riders. And we're probably going to attract people from outside the cycling community going forward, and seeing that as an entertainment factor, because it's one of the few Olympic esports disciplines that involves human physiology, if you want to call it that. You're not playing a game or behind a simulator with a steering wheel. You're using your genetics in combination with a machine, which is the esports aspect, and you're going toe to toe with the best in the world. It's one of the few esports disciplines where the human body is probably of utmost importance. I don't know if you agree with that, Chris.
No, absolutely. What you're describing is physical esports that are in line with rowing and other events where body is the joystick. It's not like Fortnite or Call of Duty, which are also going to be involved in the Olympic esports games, as a way to engage the younger generation. And so the Olympics doesn't die a slow death as the traditionalists stop watching. The prospect of potentially winning a medal as the Olympic esports athlete must be very appealing. And I'm saying this now because I want this to be the final word. I really thoroughly enjoyed the dialogue with you and being able to toss ideas back and forth. We had a lot to discuss. So I want to just ask you one more question, and thank you very much, Aaron. You're not only well-respected, but a great friend and are always there for me. So I want to ask you, would that be a dream for you?
Of course, Chris, come on. I mean, I think for me, I need to be realistic in terms of the level. The current level at the top is just immense at the moment. And the quality athletes coming through and the guys that I'm racing week in, week out are just pushing me to my absolute limit. So I think in terms of me getting a medal, that's not going to happen. But it would be great to be selected and give it a crack and represent my country again. Every time I get to put on that green and gold African shirt, I get goosebumps. It's such a special moment. It's something I never thought I would ever experience in my life. And I've been able to do it 3 times already. So to be able to have another crack at the world champs, to represent my country at the Olympics, it would be huge for me personally. And the beauty of cycling esports, you're not bound by age. It's not one of those sports where it takes a massive amount of time and puts incredible stress on the body. It's not doing like a 5-hour road race outside. It's a short, intense effort. And that means for athletes, there's a lot more longevity in the sport. So you can race well into your 40s, I reckon. I reckon we're going to have riders. If you look at riders such as like Kristen Kalczynski, she's 42, but she's nowhere near the end of her career. She's going to be racing well into her 40s, I reckon. And we're going to see a lot of these athletes have massive careers spanning decades. Looking back at the South African squad that we sent to the world champs, or we selected for the world champs, both squads probably had the most depths out of all the squads from all the nations in terms of the experience spread. We had a rider that was 44, and then we had a youngster at 19. It's the same in the women's team. We had Kelsey van Square come through, and people in South Africa know who Kelsey is. She's been ripping it up since a youngster. And when I was living in South Africa, I knew who she was, and she was coming through the ranks. So it's no surprise that she's taken to it. Her career starting now, in her early 20s. I mean, there's decades left in Kelsey. There's decades left in Reynard Geyser, who was the youngest rider in our squad. I think for cycling esports, having the Olympics, it means a lot, and it means different things to different people. But as someone like me, who's probably a little older than the others at 42 years old, I think I've still got a couple of good few years left in me. And I like to be involved in as many as possible until my legs don't move anymore.
Well, I know that you'll continually be involved in the sport. This is a great place to stop this conversation for now. You can subscribe to the Virtual Velo Podcast on your favorite podcast provider and YouTube. You can follow Emma Martin on Instagram at biking_Emma and me at the Zamunique. You can catch Emma putting word to the action of the Echelon Racing League beginning this Saturday and also the Sunday Race Club every week on MyWhoosh. Head over to my site, thezamunique.com, and sign up for the bi-monthly newsletter to support independent cycling journalism. We will have some more impactful guests from the world of cycling esports joining myself and Emma soon, including Carla Williams and Ariel Verharen of Aeonian. Next Esports, Greg Abbott. This one you'll probably find very interesting, Aaron. CVR founder Frank Garcia is going to be joining us. 2028's Nicola Cranmer, and Cycling Canada's Josh Peacock. We have a lot of really impactful guests lined up. Thank you so much, Aaron. And to everyone who made it through this whole entire podcast, for listening and for the support. Ride safely, and goodbye.
Cheers.